Okay, so recording has started. Okay, the participants, it's my pleasure to be with you for my second time. So it's my second time I come to you with a series. So we continue our series of webinars, and it's our second time. I, on behalf of the German Kazakh University, meet with you virtually via the webinar. And our today's webinar is dedicated to the topic how to publish an article in an academic journal, a topic which is very concerns a lot of us, lots of our young scholars at German Kazakh University, but also beyond. And I'm very glad that we have a very experienced researcher to discuss this topic with me. It's a professor of guest professor of political science, Dr. Sebastьян Майер. Before Sebastьян Майер has been working at the German Kazakh University since 2018. Am I right, Sebastьян?
Since 2017 already.
2017.
Well, first of all, hello everyone. Good afternoon. So I joined the Kazakh-German University in September 2017. So the winter semester 2017 was my first semester. Yeah, so it's been almost half time. So usually DRD professors like me are in the field, so to say, for 5 years, and for me it's almost half time now. Yeah, almost two and a half years.
Thank you, Sebastьян. Thank you. So sometimes you forget how long we know each other.
Yeah.
So, but before joining the DKU, so the German Kazakh University, I will use the abbreviation DKU. So just not to get confused. Yes. So before joining the DKU, Sebastьян Майер used to work as a research fellow at the Institute for Intercultural and International Studies in Bremen. Am I right, Sebastьяn? At the University of Bremen. Yes.
That's true. Yeah.
And Sebastьяn, yes,
so I earned my PhD at the University of Viadrina, Frankfurt-Oder, which is right by the German-Polish border, so roughly 80 kilometers east of Berlin. And after earning my PhD, I went to Bremen, spent there some time, and the time just before I came to Almaty in September 2017. And I'm still an associate researcher somehow. I'm still loosely involved in a research project with the University of Bremen with this institute that you mentioned. Yeah.
And Sebastьяn has a great expertise in security studies. So in the past, he published lots of studies on security issues in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe, and so since recently also in Central Asia, and he also expert on regional cooperation. So which is why I think Sebastьяn is quite big expert. Has a big expertise on how to get published in academic journals. So as for his publications, so Sebastьяn has quite a big toll of publications, quite a big list of publications. So in the past, he published in journals like Europe-Asia Studies, in studies of international security studies. And Sebastьяn, you might add more journals where you publish your
Journal of International Relations and Development, the Review of International Studies, which is probably the highest ranking journal I used to publish with. Yeah, so Blätter für Deutsche und Internationale Politik, which is a German journal, perhaps not very well known here, which is a little bit at the bridge between, an essayistic journal and a scientific journal, which somehow leads us in the direction of our topic. Yeah, but a number of journals. Yeah.
Which I'm saying, Sebastьяn, so my choice was I made a very right choice. I mean, when picking you for this conversation, so I believe that you will be the right person to introduce us to this unknown world of scientific publications. So, and just to start our conversation, so Sebastьяn, I would ask you to say a few words about your past experience. So I see we have now 4 people joined us in this conversation. Yes, and I believe, all of us were very young scholars, and very early in our academic career, and of course we're very much concerned about this pressure to publish something. So you know this expression or the saying in English, publish or perish. So, my first question to you: how how relevant is it today? I mean, to be published or to get your articles published in academic journals. I mean, how relevant is it today for young scholars?
Yeah. I mean, this pun just came to my mind, publish or perish, before you mentioned it. Yeah, I would have mentioned it myself if you didn't do that. So I think there is a lot of pressure indeed. That's true. However, it depends a little bit on which path you're going. And I mean, if we start at the students, at the student level, and I think the audience here for this webinar are probably 90 or 100, almost 100% students. Of course, it a little bit depends on what you are planning after graduation. Of course, not everybody, let's take our faculty of world politics, political science, social sciences, is becoming a researcher afterwards. So there is considerably less pressure if you don't plan that. Sometimes, I think even particularly in the UK, I mean, the UK people, and you've earned your PhD yourself from Exeter, so perhaps you would agree, UK people are sometimes very pragmatic, very straightforward. I think sometimes if you pursue a career in the non-scientific world, it can be a disadvantage, even if you have a long list of publications and you want to pursue a career in an international organization, being some, you know, officer, IO officer or whatever, it could be even a disadvantage. It depends a little bit on the environment and what you're planning to do. But I think generally, as a credential also, you know, it is of course good to have publications, decent publications, and especially of course, if you are somehow planning a scientific career. And yeah, and I think you cannot start early enough. And perhaps, I mean, my first publication dates back to the late 1990s, in 1999, when I did a internship in a think tank that doesn't exist anymore in Cologne about Eastern European studies, BIOST, so-called BIOST, and it was unpaid. But the staff told, well, Sebastian, you can earn some money by publishing a report. And I was, you know, very much supported. It was about NATO Eastern enlargement and Russia's reaction to that. A small, really 6 pages piece. And here it started. And then during the course of my PhD, I did my second publication. And I can just encourage everyone pursuing a career, start publishing early enough, because you get feedback, you learn how this works in the publishing world. So I think it's very important, and this publish and perish really is true. I mean, there is a lot of pressure on scholars, on young scholars, to publish, and not only to publish generally, but also to publish in decent journals, to which we still come, I think, during the course of our discussion.
Sebastian, you said something about your first experience with publications, with publishing academically. Tell us a little bit more about your first experience as a young researcher, when you completed your PhD, when you started as a postdoc. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, perhaps I start a small step earlier, talking briefly about the publication that I did during the course of my PhD, which I published in the German journal Integration. It's a journal that still exists, but I think for the purpose of our talk here, it's important to mention that by that time, it was a non-peer-reviewed journal. So it was like a little bit in this, still a relatively decent journal, relatively well known, but non-peer reviewed. So it was at the editorial board's discretion what to publish and what not to publish. Still, it was my first step into this academic world, and I got feedback from members of the editorial board, what I could improve about the paper. And that somehow I could use for improving the quality of my PhD, which I did on the European Union in the Southern Caucasus. So it was very helpful. That was my first experience with the journal. And then after earning the PhD in Bremen, I used to be in a so-called collaborative research center, which is titled Transformations of the State, where we looked in an interdisciplinary project where we looked at different policy fields, how policy areas change, particularly with greater powers of international organizations. I was responsible for security politics with my focus on NATO and the European Union. And that was a very stimulating environment because we had a lot of money. It was the first collaborative research center in the first place in Germany, very well funded by the German Research Foundation. So we had money to go to international conferences. We had methods courses about interview techniques and so forth. So that was a very stimulating environment. Also demanding because we were sort of under pressure to publish or perish. But I did my first, my third, fourth publications beyond these initial ones. And I published my second book in German though, but at a campus publishing house, which particularly in economics is has a relatively good reputation. So that was my postdoc period, which then was enlarged due to other projects in Bremen. But that was my first experience. Yeah.
Sebastьяn, I know that's very tough in academia when it comes to choosing the academic journal. So also to start in writing your scientific article, it's very tough. It's as such it's very tough job. I mean, because journals are very picky. You have to be very, and the competition is very strong. So you have to be very careful when choosing the topic and then writing. What is the first thing that you have to pay attention to when starting to write something? I mean, in other words, what does it mean to write? What does scientific writing mean? I mean, to you, or what would be your advice to us?
That's sort of a twofold question. What is scientific writing, and what do you? Starting with the scientific writing thing. Scientific writing, of course, is something that, in its essence, is writing from scientists for scientists to an extent. Also, it can be for the lay public, for like in the sense of popular science, where your target audience is not other scientists of your same discipline, but non-scientists or scientists from other disciplines. But in its essence, of course, scientific writing is about communicating the results of your research to other scientists. And of course, that involves a number of criteria. I think we cannot discuss the criteria and all the details, but like objectivity, replicability, you should use evidentiary support, you should use sources, you should frame a clear argument, you should have a good research question. The order is perhaps not the right order. Everything starts with a good research question, which is a very important thing and difficult thing also. And then if it comes to publishing in journals, I think the advice I can always give from my experience is talk to older colleagues, talk to your professors, for students, if you plan to publish. Usually you do that at the earliest at the MA level, during the course of your MA. I mean, in very exceptional cases, BA students start publishing already. But then, of course, in particular, when you do your PhD. And I think really don't do trial and error. I mean, don't just send your manuscript out to one journal, see what happens, because usually your choice should be somehow informed, and there is a huge abundance of scientific journals out there. It's very difficult to navigate through these journals, not only with regard to the discipline, but also with regard to the specific, let's say, disciplinary background, especially in the international relations discipline. You have, unlike in comparative politics, you have sometimes very diverse subdisciplinary backgrounds, like history, like economics, like sociology. And different international relations journals usually subscribe to specific subdisciplinary backgrounds. Some are more into economics, some are more into sociology. And I think this is one good example to alert students that it's very difficult to choose the right journal, because usually from the title itself, it's difficult to judge, in which direction, what, subdisciplinary expectations it has. So my first and most important advice probably is talk to other people, talk to your professors for students, talk to older students, to older colleagues. When you consider publishing a manuscript, so I think that's very important. And then if it comes to the details, I'm not sure if we talk later about that or in the same kind of sense. Of course, you need to prepare the manuscript very well. You have to meet certain standards. Only that a manuscript is officially received by a journal. I mean, technically received. It shouldn't be longer than a maximum word count. Then sometimes if the quality is not good enough, sometimes a manuscript is refused right away before it enters any stage of peer review. So be very careful and talk to other people and let other people see your manuscript before you submit it to a journal. I think, with this integration journal, where I published during my PhD, I did it without anyone having a look at it. So that was probably my mistake. I still succeeded. But it was also not a bad journal, but it was a medium ranking, a little bit. It was non-peer reviewed at this point. And this is an associated advice I can give. Don't reach out as a natural scientist, as a PhD student, to publish with Nature right away, or as a social science international relations scholar. Don't strive to publish with international relations or the American Review of Political Science, the very top journals with impact factors like 2.5, 3. In most cases, that doesn't work unless you study at a very prestigious university, you have a very prestigious advisor, but usually start at a relatively low level, a pragmatic choice, choose a decent but not extremely high-ranking journal, and talk to other people, communicating what you want to do and take into account advice of other people.
Is it advisable in the process of writing and submitting your paper, or in the course of this process of submission of your article, of your manuscript, is it advisable to contact the editorial board?
What do you mean during the process? You mean after it has been submitted?
No.
Or you mean before considering submission?
Before considering this, to submit your article or your manuscript to this or that article, or is that journal? Is it advisable to contact the editorial board?
That's a good question. And frankly speaking, my answer would be probably no. And I tell you why. I have, at least if it comes to peer-reviewed journals, like let's say medium level to higher level journals, if you're talking about like more lower level or non-peer reviewed journals, more essayistic ones, that might make sense. I did it, for example, with Blätter für Deutsche and Internationale Politik, which is a relatively prestigious German journal where people like Habermas have published, yeah, but rather relatively essayistic. It's not science in the narrow sense. And here I had the luck, you know, to publish there. And here I asked before, you know, is that feasible? It was well, too difficult to talk about the content. So in this case, it might make sense. But my experience is that if it comes to more higher ranking journals, and this is out of my experience because I tried it several times to sense out, because I had a manuscript that was sometime like in between a book review and a scientific article of its own. And that's, I was very unsecure, you know, in which category it fits. And I was asking several journals, two, 3 journals, and their response was, well, I mean, if you want to publish with us, do officially submit, then we will give it into the peer review if we deem it, you know, the quality good enough, but we cannot really give any advice before. So that would be, I fear that this would be the standard response. Perhaps what you can expect is a very short answer. Perhaps it rather fits into this or that category. But I think what you should not expect before peer review starts to get a sophisticated response on what you should do and how you should do that. I think decent journals really expect submit it, and then they will decide, the editorial board as such, they have their meetings, and then your manuscript will be subject to whether in the first place the manuscript is good enough for peer review. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, manuscripts already are stopped at this page. The very top journals like international organization, they boast of, you know, only 5% of the manuscripts submitted to this journal are eventually being published, meaning that 95% of the manuscripts submitted to this journal are refused either before peer review publishing starts or after peer review publishing. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's one of the, perhaps the very top journal, international organization, and the less important they are, the less severe these criteria are. But I think that points out that mostly editorial boards would not be very keen on discussing at great lengths the manuscript before. But you can always try, but my experience is rather negative with regard to that. Rather talk to other people whom you know, more experienced people who published already at a journal where you plan to publish, ask about their experience, ask them to have a look at your manuscript, and then perhaps ask for advice how to improve it. Because if you're insecure, that also sometimes leaves a bad impression for the editorial board, and they would wonder, well, I mean, why should we take this person? Better be confident and turn in a manuscript that is already very well advanced. Yeah.
Sebastьяn, provided your article, your manuscript was accepted by the editor, so you received this letter from him saying that, well, you're welcome to publish in our journal. So your article meets your manuscript meets our requirements. So, and now it goes into the review process. So, what to expect from this review process?
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, what I expect, what everybody can expect from this review process is feedback. Mm-hmm. You get feedback from your peers, from usually distinguished, depending on the journal, of course, a little bit. But if you aim at a journal with an impact factor of, let's say, 1.2, 1.5 or higher, usually you have very well-known figures. And often you might pose the question, where do these reviewers come from? And I think the regular answer is, the standard answer will be usually they are authors of articles in this very journal. So at some point, if you succeed, if you are successful in publishing with this journal, at some point you will be asked for peer review yourself, you know, because you sort of took their service, you got feedback from other people, and then you would be expected, if you succeed, if they acknowledge you as an established scholar, you would be expected to give feedback yourself. So you get feedback on your manuscript, very helpful feedback. And of course, in giving feedback, it's an instrument sort of quality control. I mean, eventually, after you amend a manuscript, the quality will improve. And there is a standard, like there is a kind of development in the scientific world. During the last decades, I would say, where an increasing number of journals is switching to peer review publishing. And the very one that I mentioned before, Integration, is a good example of that. In 1999, it was non-peer reviewed, but now it is. So I think on average, the quality of articles finally published does improve. That is not to say probably that none of all of the non-peer reviewed journals, of which are not so many, is necessarily rubbish what is being published there. I mean, the Blätter für Deutsche and Internationale Politik is a good example that I mentioned. They're still peer reviewed, but people like Habermas, Amartya Sen, and other people have published there. Usually it's a little bit popular science, what they have been published before. But then in this case, they have a very knowledgeable scientific board and they have a look at that. So that's a sort of quality control as well. But on average, I think the quality is improving. And your question was, how do you react, right? If you have the peer reviews in front of you, usually
yeah, that would be my next question. So once you get this, I mean, the comments from the reviewers, I mean, should we pay attention? Should we consider every comment of the reviewers? So what happens if you happen to disagree with some comments? I mean, are you allowed to disagree with the reviewers? I mean, so what is? I mean, how we should kind of how should the answer to the reviewers' comments?
Yeah,
and yes, what?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's very important questions. And I mean, first of all, because I think we didn't talk about that in detail, and that's important for the students. The usual peer review process is blind peer review, yeah, and most often double blind, which means that there will be two distinguished reviewers whom you don't know. Their names are not revealed to you, and also they don't know the author, yeah, the scientist delivering the manuscript. And that involves a lot of, you know, hiding sources in your manuscript, which might reveal that this manuscript might be from this and this author. But the expectation is really that the author and the reviewers do not know each other. And even the usually two reviewers do not know each other. Yeah, I mean, I've been peer reviewer several times and I didn't know who the other reviewer was. Yeah, so it's a blind review process. And then you have usually two reviews in front of you. And then you pointed out that you might disagree with one recommendation. Usually you get the reports, even if the reports are both very bad, or sometimes it's 3 reports, if sometimes are very negative in their findings, one is positive, then usually you're out. Then the editorial board says, well, Mr. Meyer, in this sense, unfortunately, your manuscript is not good enough. The reviews are on average too bad. Unfortunately, we cannot publish. If, which is usually the case, they are somehow positive, but with some negative connotations, with recommendations for what to take on board. And 90% of this you incorporate, you amend your paper and so forth, but then there is one recommendation that you are not content with. This is one case, or there might be also conflicting recommendations that that peer reviewer 1 recommends something while reviewer 2 argues in the opposite direction. I mean, usual suspect is, yeah, you should go more into the details and illuminating this and this topic. The other reviewer would say, well, you should frame it more abstractly, you should more, you know, go on generalizability. So then you would have conflicting expectations of reviewers. Mm-hmm. Usually, in such situations, the editorial board, if it's a good editorial board, they would preempt that already. And in their letter to you, they would already say, well, I mean, they would summarize the thrust of the reviews. And then they would say, well, we are aware that there are conflicting expectations. We, the editorial board, believe that you should rather lean towards reviewer 2 instead of reviewer 1. So in this case, you have some guidance, sort of, but it may also be, and this is kind of more what your question was up to, that you're simply you have an expectation from the editorial board, from the reviewers, but you're not content with it. It is legitimate to say that, to voice that I don't want to incorporate this recommendation, but it should be on good grounds. You should not simply say, well, I don't want this because I think it's stupid. You should really mention why. And if you do that in a convincing fashion, and otherwise, usually if you say, well, I take like out of, let's say, I'm still on the screen.
Yes, we are still on screen, Sebastьян, don't worry.
Yeah, okay. So if you say, well, there are 10 recommendations, let's say, for amendments, 9 of these recommendations I take on board. I'm almost fully content with that. Only with one I have reservations, and I don't want to do it because of this and this. And you really explain why. And otherwise, it's a good manuscript. I think it will be accepted, and you would still have a chance to being published. But don't be stubborn. I think if you're stubborn and if you don't mention any reason why you don't want to do that, then there can be refusal. I mean, and very important is also that you can analyze the wording, sort of so-called it's called conditional submit. Yeah, if you get a letter from a journal, it's a conditional submit. Even if your manuscript is very well advanced, each editorial board of decent journals will avoid one thing for sure, giving you the impression that your publication is for granted. Yeah, you will always get the phrasing, the reviews were rather positive, yet there are a number of changes to be taken on board. If you take all these changes on board, all these recommendations, or give good grounds why you don't take some recommendations on board, then we will consider publishing your paper. I think you will never get an answer in the sense of, yes, you made it, we will publish your paper for sure. It's always to kind of push the authors to the limits to really still improve the quality, because in many cases, even the best manuscripts can still improve a little bit. Yeah, But this consent is always possible, but do it really on good grounds. Don't do it because you're lazy and because you think you don't have enough time. I mean, these would be very bad reasons for not taking recommendations on board.
My next question. So after you managed to revise all the reviews and you've done it on time and resubmitted your article again, so what comes next? What comes next? So your article goes to the editor, or what's next? What is the next step?
After you incorporated the comments, yeah, I mean, then usually the editorial board meets, or perhaps there is usually one out of the editorial board that is particularly familiar with your topic, with your article topic. That's an internal empowerment if an editorial member has the power, you know, to give green light. But usually then you get an email such as, we are very pleased that you took all or most comments by the reviewers on board. We are very happy to announce that we are prepared to publish your paper, but then sometimes, or perhaps even most often, comes a process of copy editing. You make
colleagues, can you switch off your microphones, because otherwise we can hear Sebastьян.
Yeah, so there might be still minor revisions after you took the most important comments on board. Sometimes also like just editorial things, stylistic things. I mean, usually decent journals provide for copy editing, and copy editing often involves brushing the language for non-English native speakers. But sometimes a journal might ask you, well, the scientific quality is good, it's ready, but still the style has to be improved, and perhaps there are some sources missing, minor stuff like that. And then, yeah, sometimes they give you the signal, we are ready, you made it, sort of, we give you green light, but still, you still have to do this and that, more technical. And after that, we will be ready for publishing. And then sometimes it depends on, sometimes you get the, how do you say, Druckfahne in German, the camera ready copy that is, you know, sort of in the style of the journal, with paginated, with pages, sort of camera ready for printing, and then this will be often your last opportunity where you make final changes and then goes into print. And I mean, this process of publication should not be underestimated. It can take a year and a half, sometimes from or even 2 years from the point of submitting the first manuscript and then final publication. Usually the more decent a journal is, the longer it may take, because you're in a queue of other accepted articles. And the peer review process itself can take up to, starting from 4 weeks up to 4 or 5 months even, depending on, yeah. But that would be sort of the final stage. You have the camera ready, copy in front of you, and then you are lucky to have your manuscript published. Yeah, so this is roughly the procedure.
Thank you, Sebastьян. Sebastьяn, I know some colleagues who say, they don't say that, but I know that they gave up. I mean, after receiving reviews, they gave up this process, the entire process, by saying, well, the reviews were too substantial, or and did not want, I mean, to work on the revisions that they received. I mean, what would be your advice? I mean, should we give up, I mean, after receiving the reviews? Because, yes.
My advice would be never give up,
Never give up,
but never give up. But my advice would also be, and that's a repetition of my advice from the beginning, think carefully which journal to choose, and really talk to other people, talk to more experienced scholars who might be more familiar with this publishing world. Because I think the worst thing that can happen to you is if you have a good manuscript, your manuscript is very well for the standards of a specific journal, but you choose the wrong journal. You choose the wrong journal. Yeah. Either, and I think there are two possibilities. Either you strive too high. You want to publish with international organization, but you would have succeeded with a lower ranking journal. That's kind of a question of reputation. But it might also be that simply within roughly the same level of reputation, and as I said, there are so many journals, there is one journal out there that caters more specifically the disciplinary background that you subscribe to when doing your manuscript. So that's a very bad thing if you have a manuscript that would fit actually this and this journal. Yeah, let's say, let's take an example. Europe-Asia Studies is known for its rather empirical. It's a decent journal. It's a very decent journal. But it's more known for its empirical, for empirically substantial works. There is Post-Soviet Affairs, which is more comparative politics, is more methods-driven, it's more theory-driven. And just, well, there is a matter of reputation. I mean, Europe-Asia Studies has a lower impact factor than post-Soviet affairs, but let's assume they're roughly the same level. And you have a manuscript that is empirically substantial, that is very good, measured on certain criteria, and you submit it to post-Soviet studies, which expects, theoretically, methodologically sophisticated manuscripts, then you simply choose the wrong journal. And that's, of course, very bad, that's not then a question of, giving up or not giving up. I mean, I think making an empirically solid manuscript, turning it into a theoretical one is very difficult, if not impossible. So in this case, you would have succeeded if you talked carefully to more experienced scholars, saying, well, have a look at it, at this manuscript, a careful look, or just a glimpse of it, or telling a little bit about the contents. And then an experienced scholar would right away say, well, this is empirically, I would rather submit it to Europe-Asia Studies rather than to Post-Soviet Affairs or to some other journal. And the same is true with other journals. So already this decision and a little bit thinking ahead and, choosing carefully saves you a lot of time and saves you from a negative experience. So don't give up if you get negative reviews, premised on the fact that you choose the right journal, and then you get negative replies by reviewers. Don't give up. Even if you're refused, if you're not refused, and if they say, well, we have substantial reservations, we still consider, I mean, then you're lucky. I mean, they generally, and then I would, of course, invest the time, improving it and then resubmitting it. But usually, if the reviews are bad, they would refuse right away. Even in this situation, don't give up. Use these insights, use this valuable feedback still to improve your paper and then submit it to a journal a little bit lower ranking. Yeah. submit it somewhere else. However, sometimes it's difficult. You cannot do that forever. Always, starting very high and then going lower, because I think in the process of submitting, you might be asked whether you submitted this manuscript already before. And databases used for manuscript delivery, like Manuscript Central, is a very important, very widely used source. And then, one journal might know that you submitted this manuscript already previously, and then sometimes they will not be very keen, on publishing a piece that has been submitted anywhere else. So be careful about that. But generally, don't give up. Try to publish it somewhere else at a lower ranking journal, and always consider even negative critique as a feedback, as a valuable feedback to improve the manuscript. Yeah, that's always helpful to view it in a positive fashion. Yeah, although it might not be easy sometimes. Yeah.
Sebastьяn, we've spoken about, so till now we've spoken about the right journals, so let's call them the right journals, yes. But there are so many predatory journals, you know them, so, and they're particularly widespread in countries like Kazakhstan or in other post-Soviet countries. So predatory journals which, can publish or accept your articles or your manuscript straightforward, and you can publish it straightforward. My questions to you, how to recognize, your advice to scholars like us, to young scholars, how to recognize such predatory journals, and do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, my first advice is the one that I mentioned already: ask more experienced scholars. Yeah, if you are getting an offer, and I'm getting such offers, often they end up in my spam folder, but sometimes I see them. Ask more experienced scholars if this is a decent journal. Usually, frankly speaking, the second step will be to talk about specific criteria to recognize such journals on your own. And I think a first criterion would be, where you should be suspicious. If you are a young student, 18, 19 years old, and there is an email from some journal in your email list saying, I don't know how that would happen, that a student would receive such an email, but at least younger scholars, not very known yet. We are pleased. We learned that you're an extremely distinguished scholar. We invite you. I get invitations of publishing, editing special issues of some journals. Yeah, and you should get suspicious already. Of course, that's difficult because being a young scholar, you're always feeling yourself cherished. If someone approaches you and saying you're a great scholar and please publish with us, but you should use common sense, telling that, frankly speaking, I'm not a distinguished scholar yet, and there could be something wrong with this journal approaching me. So that's first thing, use common sense. The second thing, I think, I get to see them very rarely, but sometimes they don't end up in the spam folder. And what I recognize about these predatory journals is that they have very broad, absurdly broad names. Decent scientific journals, frankly speaking, sometimes that's not quite true, because even decent journals sometimes have relatively broad names: international affairs, or so, international relations, very decent journals, international organization. But still, these predatory journals sometimes use absurdly broad labels like Journal of Social Science. Yeah. If you see such a name, and I think such a journal, such a predatory journal exists, yeah, it's so absurdly broad that you could do history, you could do economics, you could do sociology, psychology, political science. Yeah, this is not very common for specialized, decent journals. That they would use such a broad label. Yeah, so Journal of Social and Human Sciences. Yeah, if you see something like that, very broad like that, you should be very careful. That's the second thing, the second criterion. The third criterion, and perhaps the most important, is if they ask you for money. Yeah. Usually good journals do not take money for publishing your articles. There are some exceptions. I will talk about the exceptions in a second. But generally, predatory journals, and this is where the very name comes from, predatory meaning they rob you, they rob your money, you know, which you otherwise are not supposed to give if you publish with a decent journal, ask you for $500, $600, and then the quality is poor. Usually they don't sell because decent journals, they sell. They have, of course, marketing techniques. They sell their journals to libraries, to universities. They subscribe to these journals, so they earn money. Predatory journals usually have such a poor quality that they cannot sell their articles. So they're really reliant on authors paying. And if this is the case, if they ask you to pay $500, $600, and then we will publish, don't do that. Yeah. So that's a very important criterion. I said that there are some exceptions, and I would say in some cases payment is legitimate, even for high-scale, good non-predatory journals. But that's very specific circumstances, and one circumstance is open access. Yeah, that's a service offered, I think, by almost each journal, each decent journal so far, that they would offer you, because usually they would sell the articles to libraries, to universities, to private subscribers, and so forth. You have the option, if you want to increase the visibility, that you pay the decent journal $600, $800 or euros, often paid by your institution or by the research in which you're involved, the institution, and then you pay this amount, and then your article will be open access, which means that everybody can access this article. And that's a huge exception. If they ask you for this kind of money, then this doesn't necessarily mean it's a predatory journal. That can be very decent journals. If you look in the table of contents of decent journals, you will sometimes see that there is a kind of log that is open, sort of, with a green background, meaning that you can simply click on this article, no matter if you have a subscription or not to this journal, and you can simply access this article. And that's good, that increases visibility. So that's one exception. And then other exceptions are if some journals ask you for money if the style of your language as a non-native speaker is poor. And some journals say, well, we don't consider this our duty to improve the quality of your language. You may have to involve editorial writing, for which you pay 300, 400, 500 euros to brush your article, to pay for it, and then it will be published. But that's rather rare, I would say. I think most decent journals wouldn't even accept a manuscript in the first place if it doesn't have a certain standard. So these are exceptions, but it might happen sometimes. And also in this case, don't worry about that if they ask you money about that. But if they ask you about money for the very publication, and this is, you see that this is the general Geschäftsmodell, the general way of doing business for a certain journal, then stay away from that. And also don't tell yourself, maybe I can start with the predatory journal. I mean, you can ruin your career. I mean, if you publish in such a journal, if you want to become an established scholar, what you can always do is simply, you know, then skip that article on your publication list. But still, then you would have invested a lot of time and money, which is for nothing if you don't show it. So stay away from those articles. So I think these are the most visible criteria for identifying predatory journals. Yeah.
Thanks, Sebastian. Thanks. Sebastian, my next question is also very important for us. I mean, in Kazakhstan, what are the ethical considerations that we, young scholars, have to take in account when writing an article, when submitting for publication? Are there any ethical considerations that we have to consider?
You mean like from the choice of the topic, you mean, or what do you mean, no, considerations?
During the process of writing, I mean, what we have to consider, I mean, what ethical requirements we have to consider. I know there is a problem of plagiarism, you know, in countries like Kazakhstan, etc. So are they strict enough? I mean, and how important is it to consider them when wanting to come to submit this publication, this manuscript for publication?
Yeah, I mean, plagiarism, of course, is a big issue, and you know probably, and maybe you have been to Germany at this point in Freiburg when this happened, but in Germany there was a huge scandal, like about 8 years ago, when even one minister, the Minister of Defense, Theodor zu Guttenberg, had to resign from his post because it was found out that in his PhD he did plagiarism, and it was a coincidence that one lawyer with whom I collaborated at this point, Andreas Fischer-Lescano, was the very person who found that out, because he was a rather left-wing, you know, a scholar. He wanted to use a more conservative style PhD. I don't know what the PhD was about. So he looked at it in greater detail and found out, well, there is plagiarism. So Andreas Fischer-Lescano, with whom I collaborated, was the person finding that out. And then with a huge number of other scholars and high-level figures, who often did not lose their job, but have been checked. So it's a very big issue. And for students, of course, they might be expelled from the university. I mean, this is what could happen at this level, at the student level. So do take this issue seriously. And at the Kazakh-German University, I know, because I'm currently supervising for BAC this, I know that in the procedure we have a sort of plagiarism control tool. Yeah, I'm not sure if that is you have to pay for that. I think it's a professional tool. I'm not sure if there is anti-plagiarism software freely accessible in the internet, where students can, to make sure themselves, because plagiarism might be unintentional, yeah, and before, or it might be intentional, but you try to hide it very well, and then just want to make sure that you are not caught, you know, at the university level, so that you're doing it yourself in the internet. I'm not sure if that exists, but I saw something like that, perhaps free of charge. So, but the general hint, of course, is do quote properly. I mean, do identify the sources you use. And I think an often misunderstanding is that you are not, as a scholar, allowed to use ideas of other scholars. I think that's a huge misunderstanding. because science works in such a way that scientists speak to one another. I mean, the most important and prestigious thinkers of our time and past time, whom we consider great scientists like Immanuel Kant or Habermas, who draws on Kant and so forth, draw on insights from other scholars, and they might themselves become big scholars. However, it is important to quote properly and to sort of reveal, you know, what your writing comes from, and that might be with quotations, and then naming the source. It might be without quotations, but still using a proper source. So yeah, I think we cannot go into the details. That would be a webinar of its own. But I mean, the general thrust is really do quote properly, and also to avoid self-plagiarism, which is of course more important for scientists than students who usually publish their first time or well, do science the first time when they do their BA thesis or some Hausarbeit that they perhaps publish somewhere. Of course, that's at a very low level, but still, self-plagiarism at a later stage becomes important as well, which is more accepted, but it might be a problem even of copyrights. If you have published an article in this journal at this and this publishing house, and then you publish another article that uses perhaps 30, 40, 50% of the previous text, but these are different publishing houses, different journals, you might run into copyright problems, yeah, because the first one would say, well, we didn't allow you that, you know, to use, even if it's your own text, but we have the copyright. It depends, of course. So be careful about self-plagiarism as well. Yeah. Did I answer your question fully,
yeah,
or
yeah,
was there some part
it was very good. It was very good answer.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
Sebastian, my very last question, so because we are running out of time, so my very last question concerns the online resources. Perhaps you know of any online resources that you would suggest to young scholars. I mean, on writing, publishing, presenting, because writing, as you understand, is a skill, very important skill that you have to train time and again. So, what are the online resources that you know of that you would advise to young scholars like us?
Yeah, I mean, I know of one source that just comes to my mind, and that's kind of the, it's called Writing Center or something like that, from Duke University in the United States. That is something that recently came to my mind when I looked at this issue. But I'm sure if students Google like scientific writing, if they do a string like scientific writing in quotations, and perhaps add the subject they're interested in, because it's also, I mean, scientific writing in social sciences, in natural sciences, in engineering, there are sometimes very different standards. And of course, it's important for students to get these scientific criteria and scientific hints most appropriate for their discipline in which they are embedded. So perhaps add another string, scientific writing and social sciences or something like that. And then I'm very sure you would find many results from universities that sort of reveal their scientific writing hints, sometimes for their own students. But they do it openly. They put it in the internet of their university homepage. They don't close it into the intranet for practical purposes, sometimes because they want to do other students, non-university students, simply a courtesy so that they can access. So I'm pretty sure there are many resources that can be accessed. So try, I can just encourage trying using these search words. But Duke University is something where I know they have something like that, publicly accessible, where you could start. But then, of course, in the Kazakh-German University, I know that in Fomanova, there are several books as well about scientific writing in English, in German, in Russian. So use these sources, and we might think at Kazakh-German University as well, maybe my Center for Research and Graduate Education might be doing that, perhaps to provide such a resource, perhaps intranet, perhaps internet, I'm not sure, with perhaps general hints like that. Perhaps we can put this webinar there as well as a resource. So yeah, but Duke University is perhaps something where you might look at, yeah, as a first step. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Sebastьян. It was very great to talk with you. So to have this conversation on a very important topic for all of us. I mean, for young scholars or for early career researchers. So thank you very much. So I just noticed we have 4 more participants on this webinar. So I hope there are some questions from the audience. If not,
yeah.
No questions. But anyway, so there will be recording of this conversation and be posted on the website of the KU. So which is why. So I believe that some more people can join us. I mean, and to watch this recording later on. Yeah. So Sebastьяn,
hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, we hear you.
I'm a student of the Kazakh-German University. My name is Ashat. You know me.
Hello, sir. I know you.
And my question is to Sebastьяn that is it better to publish at beginning, to publish it own? Maybe you have already answered on this question, because I have participated only 30 minutes ago. And my question is it important better to publish at the own your country, for example, journals, or all from the beginning you need to go to the international journals? Or what you advise to students?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. A good question. Yeah. So the question is, do you publish in your own country or do you publish internationally? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. In the beginning.
In the beginning. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good question. Yeah. I think it depends, of course, on the, let's say, if we're talking at the beginning, BA level, MA level, early MA level. I think it really depends on how good your manuscript is. I mean, the quality often, of course, hinges on whether it is suitable for publishing internationally. But again, also, I mean, international doesn't mean necessarily a better quality, compared to national. And of course, if you're situated in the US or the UK, then international becomes sort of an absurd criterion. But let's say English-speaking versus non-English-speaking journals. Even within, non-English-speaking journals, like Russian journals, German journals, on the one hand, and English-speaking journals on the other hand, there are differences of quality. I mean, well, even if we leave aside these predatory journals, even decent journals, sometimes they are more pragmatic and so forth. So it depends really very much on the piece you're planning to publish. And that's, of course, very difficult to tell. A general advice. The advice I can give again is show this piece to your professor, show this piece to more experienced scholars and say, well, this is what I want to publish. Do you have any idea? And then the question is the quality good enough? You still have the possibility to improve the quality. but also what I think is very important that I mentioned, choose the right journal, because it might be a very specific background, specific question. So only more experienced scholars can help you. And one possibility, of course, it's difficult to do that, but it's also to co-publish with more experienced scholars. Yeah, I mean, for us, for Serik and me as professors at the Kazakh-German University is, of course, difficult, you know, because if we would advertise this possibility more loudly, then, you know, next week, half of the students would approach us. Mr. Майер, Mr. Serik, Mr. Baimanbetov, can you publish with us, with me? You know, I have some idea. No, so that's perhaps not feasible on a large scale. But if you did a good presentation, student presentation, perhaps you earn a good grade. Why not? Perhaps at the MA level, why not? Perhaps talking to your professor. Do you have any idea where to publish that? Is there perhaps even the possibility to do it together, something like that? I don't want to raise really wrong expectations, but that's also a possibility. Yeah. So I think no general answer. It really depends on the quality and the thrust of your paper, and it depends on which national and international journals we are talking about. Yeah. So a Westnik, a good Westnik of a decent university might be your first starting point at the national level to publish. But perhaps even a rather lower ranking journal, English-speaking journal at the international level. But generally it is more difficult. Yeah. So my general advice would be talk to more experienced scholars and ask for specific advice how to publish what you're thinking of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Sebastian. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, Sebastian. It was great to have you, Sebastian, on this conversation. So I'm really happy to have talk with you about this very important topic for all of us. So I think we've covered many questions with you. Perhaps not all questions that we wanted to talk about, but anyway, what I'm particularly happy about is that we received one question from the audience. Perhaps more questions will come in the next few minutes, but anyway, so Sebastian, I wish you many more scientific publications ahead, and for all of us, don't be afraid to get published. And thank you one more time, Sebastian. Yes, thank you to you.
Yeah. Okay, Serik, many thanks for suggesting this topic, the very suggestion of this topic, which is very important. And thanks for answering smart questions, because I hope that the answers to your questions were helpful. But good answers can only come if they are smart questions, and you did pose smart questions. And the audience as well was a smart question as well. So thank you very much. If there is no one else from the audience, then we should probably end here, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you. It was great to see you again. So
okay. So good luck. Good luck.
Can I ask one more question? If it's not. How does the amount of the publications and maybe the quality of publications, how it influence on the possibility to get, for example, scholarship or other stipendium? Has it the influence, or the people often look only on the grades and on the for example Fachrichtung of the
specialization?
Yeah. That's a very good question as well. I mean, perhaps Serik can add something from his experience as well. I mean, I think we are both somehow still, or in the past at least, having been to selection committees. We had a look at a great number of applications in the past. And my reply, my answer would be, it's perhaps, it doesn't, let's put it like that. A small list of publications. Let's assume we are talking about an application for an MA scholarship from the DAAD, from the German Academic Exchange Service, because I'm probably most familiar with these applications. And at this level, late BA level, usually, where the stage at which people would apply for an MA scholarship, you could expect no more than, let's say, 3, 4, 5 publications, if there are publications at all. I would say 95, 98% of the applicants have no publications at all. Yeah, but some do have. And then usually, and that's also a plea, you know, for trying, usually they didn't publish in international organization. They didn't publish in the American Review of Political Science. Yeah. They publish in Westnik, they publish in some, you know, small scale student journal, perhaps something like that. But still, I think it is not too bad if the application as such is gives a good impression as well. Yeah. So if they're good grades, if the letter of motivation is good, selection of the university is convincing, and what you want to do and why you want to study further in an MA program, if this is good, and then on top of it, you have 2, 3, 4 publications that can leave an imprint on a member of the selection committee, telling, wow, I mean, this is a good person. I mean, she or he knows in which direction to go, and their first scientific credentials. And I think at this stage, it's really rather unimportant if these are great journals or not. It's rather a sign of scientific interest, yeah, compared to other people who don't have anything there. So I would suggest, yeah, I mean, it might make really sense during your BA already, if you really want to pursue a scientific career, to consider. And then coming back to your first question, if you do that then in Kazakhstan, a national publication in a Westnik, I mean, you wouldn't expect anything else probably at this stage. So I would still be impressed as a member of the selection committee. Well, this and this person has done already something. It's a sign of commitment to science. So I think it can be a decisive plus if the application in general is good. What is not the case probably if grades are bad, if the letter of motivation is bad, and if you assume that you can compensate that by you know, the 3 publications that you did. I think that would be create a false expectation. But on top of it, it can make a difference. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure if Zirik's experience is the same, but this is at least my experience.
Yeah, I think it was you answered the question in full, Sebastьян. So from my own experience, I know that it's not so much required during the bachelor's study. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have publications during the bachelor study, but it does matter when you apply for master programs, as Sebastьян mentioned, and in particularly important when you apply for PhD. So you must have a certain publication record before you apply for PhD. So it's
yeah, with the PhD, I think also, I mean, I saw several PhD applications. Even there, it's not considered a must. And I told about my own experience. I was even compared to my fellow PhD scholars during my time, I was one of the few publishing during the PhD. So no, I had one publication before the PhD, even, but a very small scale. But at this stage, if you apply for a PhD, even nowadays at least, where expectations sometimes get, you know, tougher and competition is more fierce, yeah, I mean, that might be helpful for a PhD program. Yes, yeah.
Okay, Sebastian. Okay, colleagues. Thank you so much for Sebastian. Thank you to you. I mean, for being with us, and so thank you to all the participants who joined us during the conversation. So it was very good conversation. I believe so, Sebastian. So thank you for your for your answers to our questions, for your very.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Okay, then I say bye to everybody. Stay healthy, and see you at some other webinar. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, stay healthy and safe. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.